Hello, my name is Geraldine and I'd like to welcome you to Tule Elk State Natural Reserve. Would you like to learn a little bit about the elk today? All right, so the elk, there are actually three types of elk here in North America. Elk are part of the deer family, which include, of course, deer and moose, but we're going to talk about the elk today. So like I said, there's three types of elk. There's the Roosevelt elk. They are the largest. They weigh about 1,000 pounds, the adult males. Then next are the Rocky Mountain elk, and they have the largest population of elk in the United States, and they run through, of course, the Rocky Mountain states. And then there's the smallest. They are the Tule elk, and that's what we're going to talk a little more about today. Now, the Tule elk are about half the size of a Roosevelt elk, but yet at their shoulder, the adult males, they stand about 5 feet, and that's how tall I am, at about their shoulders. So think they still have the neck and the antlers still to go. So even for a small elk, they're still pretty big. Now, the elk used to range through Shasta all the way down to the Tehachapies. And let me show you a little bit, if we can see this. Now, the colors here are, the yellow is the Roosevelt elk, and they range up in Northern California, up into Oregon and Washington. The Rocky Mountain elk over here in blue, a little bit again in Northern California, mostly in the other states. And then there's the Tule elk, you'll see all right here in pink. Now, they are very unique, and because they are the only elk endemic to California, which means they are found only in California. And a long time ago, they ran basically all through the entire Central Valley. And now their ranges are over here, kind of south of Sacramento. And so we'll learn a little bit more about where their range was. Now, the elk are made for these hot summer days and the colder, foggier days. And if you can see behind me, there's something called Tule, and that's where the elk get their name, along with, like, say, Tulare County or the Tulare Lake Basin, all comes from the names of these tules. It's hard to imagine, but at one point in time, a lot of these tules, marshlands, the rivers came out of the mountains, flowed down, created lakes through here, the Kern River, and then on up into the Tulare Lake. And within those marshes, there was thousands and thousands of elk that used to roam the territories. And not only elk, but antelope, grizzly bear, mountain lions, and all sorts of birds and small mammals. So within all that territory, there was also the Native Americans. And the Native Americans also used the tules. The elk used them for foraging, for hiding, for keeping cool in the summer. The Native Americans used the tules for building shelters, homes, canoes, rafts, even duck decoys. And they also used them for food. The bulbs and the roots of the tule is something they used for food. So it's a very vital plant to not only the animal species that used it, but to the Native Americans that also lived here throughout the Central Valley. So think about it. Something happened. Something in 1849. Do you guys know what that could have been? Gold was discovered in California. Eureka, we have found it. So let's come over. Everybody from all over the world started coming to California. Most came by sea. And as they came in over the coastal range and came into the Central Valley, it was talked about how there was vast herds of elk. As far as the eye could see, they darkened the plains. So as the miners started heading into the inland gold fields looking for their fortunes, a few of them started going, you know, we could probably make more money selling food to the miners than we can in the gold fields themselves. So the elk were hunted for their meat and for their hides. And so these large populations of elk started to decline. And about 20 years later, probably up until about the 1870s, it almost went extinct. Now, there was a man named Henry Miller. He was an immigrant from Germany, a butcher by trade, but he wanted his fortune in cattle, and he created a vast cattle empire throughout the state. and he owned a number of pieces of land, not only down here in the southern Central Valley, but all up and through into San Francisco. And he actually saw that the Tule elk were going extinct. And he set a piece of land aside, and somewhere in there they found about 28 animals. And this was again in about 1870s. And he set those animals aside and he helped protect them. He offered rewards to anybody that if they were found poaching an elk, the people who turned them in could get a reward. So he was very determined about this. Sometimes into the late 1930s, or excuse me, into the 1930s, the 28 sort of grew into about 400. And he was getting a little desperate because they were doing damage to his crops and to maybe fences or buildings. So he finally said, "State, somebody help me. I want to protect these animals, but they are causing damage." So they created a reserve, and it was called the Tupman Reserve in the 1930s, and it is the reserve that you see behind me. It is about 960 acres, and it can hold about 25 animals. Now, our herd right now is at about 13. So you're wondering, 400 to 28 to 13, where did all these animals go? Well, over all of these years, the animals have been moved to different ranges, and like you saw on that graph that I showed you earlier, there's now about 4,000 Tule elk in the state, and they are on 24 different reserves around the state. So hopefully, if you can't come here to Tule Elk State Natural Reserve to see them, there are places that you can elsewhere. So let's take a little walk to the visitor center. I hope you'll meet me over there, and we'll learn more about the anatomy of a Tule elk, and we'll get to see some pretty neat displays. Let's go. Hi, I'm glad you're joining me again. So we're going to learn a little bit about the Tule elk and their anatomy, kind of from the ground up. So what I mean by that is, let's start with what hits the ground, the hoof. So with the hoof here, you'll see it's very slick. It's a split hoof, and it's very smooth and slick and easy for getting in and out of the mud and the wallows. So the elk can get into those Tule wallows and use them as protection and for cooling down, but they don't really get stuck in there because their legs and their hooves are designed to get out of that mud. If we walked into the mud like that, we would sink up to our hips, we would get stuck, lose our shoes, it would be a mess. So they're designed for that. And as we move up the animal, you think about their stomachs. Tule elk are a grazing animal. They're very similar to cattle. So where the deer are called bucks, does, and fawns, elk are called bulls, cows, and calves. So, and similar to that, they have a four-chambered stomach. They're a grazing animal, and as they're going around grazing on grasses, it's kind of hard to digest. So those four chambers help digest the food that they're eating. Now, a little further up on the anatomy, we have the vertebrae. So what we have here is neck vertebrae and back vertebrae. So you see how much bigger the neck is compared to the back. And that is because on the males, they are the only ones that have antlers, and they have to hold those antlers up. So this is your vertebrae. Now, the antlers. Ready for this? Very impressive. Ta-da! Not so impressive, is it? Well, this is actually a spike. Now, this is a natural slough. You can see the ridges here that it's a natural slough. When the male elk is about 1 year old, they grow a single spike. Now, what is so amazing about these animals is that they regrow these antlers every year. Starting in about February to March, they slough off those antlers, and then they grow a completely new set by July. And then by July, they have their full rack. So, but how do they do that? How do they grow them from a single spike to, say, something like this? And this is one single antler. Now, a male elk will have its full set by the age of 5 to 7 years old. But again, how do they grow them? So on this example, this is something called velvet that you can see here on the antler. And this is what helps those antlers grow. So like I said, starting in about February, March, the new antlers will actually push off the old antler and they'll fall off. And then as the new ones are growing, they're covered in this velvet, and it is holding the blood vessels to the bone of the antler and helping it to grow. Starting somewhere in July, the antlers have grown to what their length is going to be for that year. And as you can see, this velvet starts to come off. Well, they can't just pick it off, so they need to rub it on something. And that's what we talked about with Henry Miller, the damage that was being caused to his property because the elk were rubbing off their their velvet. And if you kind of can see, pan over here a little bit, this is a telephone pole. Hard to imagine, isn't it? But this is the damage that can be done by the elk rubbing their antlers up against a wooden post like this. They turned a huge telephone pole down into nothing, and then it broke away. So I also mentioned that the young are called calves. So when the young elk are born, kind of see here, now they look like a fawn. You can see the spots on this hide here. So, but that's helped to camouflage. So the females will move away from the herd to have their babies, and once the young are born, then they will keep them away for a couple of days until they're ready to move. But this helps camouflage, and they'll keep these spots for about 6 months. And as they grow older, now the males, like I said, are the bulls, but there's usually only one male for all the females. So during the rutting season, which is again usually from July to September, the master bull, he will keep all of his females to one side, and he tries to keep all the bachelors to the other side. So he's constantly moving back and forth to keep them apart. And the way he becomes the master bull is that he uses those antlers. First, it's a staring competition between another bachelor. Then it could be throwing dirt or grasses up into the air. And then finally, it could be bugling and making noise like that. And then if all of that doesn't work, then the two will actually come together and possibly have a clash of that description. Now, what we're going to see next is an example of when two bull elks come together in that clash. So here we have two bull elk that were actually here on the reserve probably about 30 years ago. And like I mentioned earlier, during the rutting season, the male elk will do those different things, and eventually they could spar, which is what's happening here. Now what happened with these two guys is when they came together, this one point off of the elk's antlers went straight into the skull of this other elk, and it killed him. And then now all of a sudden, this poor guy has 500 pounds of dead elk hanging off of his face. Not good. So unfortunately, because of that, he wasn't able to feed, and he died also. Now this is a very interesting display in the sense that these elk, or the antlers, twisted together and they couldn't pull them apart. That's why they both died. But then when the people who worked here found them, they couldn't break these antlers apart either. So that's how they were able to get this great display. So they were gone through a process called taxidermy, and they were made up into the display. So I'm going to step back here a little bit so you can see the full elk display. So I'm glad that you're spending this time with us today here at Tule Elk and learned a little bit about Central California, the Tule Elk, Native Americans, and it would pique your interest to go out and learn more. So come back sometime and visit us here at Tule Elk State Natural Reserve. Thank you.